John Kennedy exposes Van Hollen's hidden agenda. Congress erupts. The grand hearing chamber of the Senate Judiciary Committee buzzed with a restless energy, its marble floors and towering columns bathed in the soft glow of morning light filtering through tall windows. Reporters jostled for position in the press gallery, their pens scratching furiously, while aides darted between rows of polished oak desks, whispering last-minute strategies. The air was thick with anticipation, not the kind that heralded routine procedure, but the kind that signaled a storm brewing just beneath the surface of Capitol Hill's carefully curated calm. At the center of it all stood Thupper Senator Mark Van Hollen, his crisp navy suit and practiced smile betraying none of the calculations racing through his mind. This was his stage, his moment to seize control of a narrative that had spiraled dangerously out of his grasp ever since the arrest of federal judge Linda Dugan hit the headlines. The photo of Dugan, grainy off-center, captured by a bystander's phone as federal agents escorted her down the courthouse steps in handcuffs, had ignited a firestorm. Van Hollen had called this emergency hearing to douse the flames, to paint Pam Bondi, the special counsel behind the investigation, as a rogue actor whose overreach threatened the judiciary's independence. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers tapping lightly on a neatly printed opening statement, confident that his questions would corner Bondi and restore order. But across the chamber, Thupper Senator John Kennedy, the Republican from Louisiana, sat quietly, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the patience of a hunter. Known for his folksy charm and razor wit, Kennedy was no stranger to high-stakes hearings, but today his demeanor was different, less performative, more deliberate. He adjusted his glasses, glancing at the slim folder in front of him, its contents known only to him and a handful of trusted aides. This was no ordinary day in Washington, and Kennedy sensed it. The gavel fell, and committee chairwoman Judy Mason called the session to order, her voice steady, but laced with the weight of what was to come. This committee is convened to examine the circumstances surrounding the arrest of federal judge Linda Dugan and the conduct of the investigation led by special counsel Pam Bondi. She announced, her gaze sweeping the room. Cameras hummed, capturing every movement, every expression. Van Hollen wasted no time. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his tone dripping with calculated outrage, "you've become the face of a controversy that many believe was meant to stay buried. Do you deny that your investigation directly led to Judge Dugan's arrest?" Bondi, seated at the witness table, didn't flinch. Her black blazer was sharp, her posture unyielding, and her voice carried a calm that unsettled the room. "No," she said simply, her eyes meeting Van Hollen's without hesitation. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Kennedy remained still, his pen hovering over a notepad. Van Hollen pressed on, sensing an opening. "Then, let's be clear. Your role was to review financial compliance among court-affiliated nonprofits, not to initiate criminal proceedings against a sitting federal judge. Why the overreach?" Bondi opened her folder, her movements deliberate. "I followed the financial trails, Senator. They led somewhere. I didn't stop because the destination was inconvenient." The room shifted slightly, reporters scribbling, faster aides exchanging glances. Van Hollen's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "So you believe the arrest was justified?" Bondi's response was measured. "I didn't make the arrest. I made sure the facts were too loud to ignore." Kennedy's pen finally touched paper, jotting a single word. "Facts." He leaned forward, his expression unreadable, but his attention razor-sharp. Van Hollen, undeterred, pivoted to optics. "Ms. Bondi, this arrest has eroded public trust in our judiciary. You've made one judge the face of corruption. Do you realize the damage you've caused?" Bondi's voice didn't rise, but her words cut cleanly. Trust that crumbles under truth wasn't trust, Senator. It was a facade. A low gasp escaped the press gallery, and Kennedy's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. He'd seen Van Hollen's playbook before frame the witness as reckless rally the committee around institutional loyalty and bury the issue in procedural quicksand. But Bondi wasn't buckling, and Kennedy sensed an opportunity. He raised a hand, his southern drawl cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ms. Bondi, let's slow this down a bit," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "You say you followed financial trails. Mind telling us what you found at the end of that trail?" Van Hollen shot him a glance, irritation flickering in his eyes, but Kennedy ignored it, his focus locked on Bondi. Bondi nodded, pulling the document from her folder. "This is a summary of wire transfers from the Community Justice Initiative, a nonprofit that received $4.2 million in federal grants over 2 years. In 3 separate rulings, Judge Dugan issued decisions that directly benefited this organization, including one that voided a clawback clause allowing them to retain funds without audit." She slid the document toward the clerk, who passed it to Mason. Kennedy leaned closer, his voice steady but probing. "And who's running this Community Justice Initiative? Anybody we might know?" Bondi's eyes met his, a silent acknowledgement of his intent. "The treasurer is Kenneth Dugan, Judge Dugan's brother-in-law. His role was never disclosed in her conflict of interest statements." The chamber erupted in whispers, reporters typing furiously, aides scrambling to relay the bombshell. Van Hollen's smile vanished, replaced by a clenched jaw. Kennedy, however, leaned back, his expression calm, but his mind racing. He'd suspected Dugan's arrest wasn't a one-off, but Bondi's evidence pointed to something deeper, a network, not a single bad actor. "Hold on now," Kennedy said, his drawl sharpening. "You're saying a federal judge ruled in favor of an organization tied to her family and nobody thought to flag it. How's that happen?" Bondi's response was unflinching. "It happens when the system incentivizes silence. Senator, my team found 14 rulings with similar patterns, altered language, undisclosed ties, and outcomes that consistently favored specific grant recipients." She tapped the document. "This isn't one mistake. It's a design." The word design hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mason adjusted her glasses, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Ms. Bondi, are you suggesting intentional manipulation?" Bondi didn't hesitate. "I'm suggesting intent, Madame Chair." The changes were precise, benefiting the same entities repeatedly. Kennedy jotted another note, intent. He glanced at Van Hollen, whose posture had stiffened his earlier confidence, fraying at the edges. The hearing was slipping from his control, and Kennedy knew it. Van Hollen tried to regain ground. "Ms. Bondi, you're painting a picture of conspiracy based on technicalities. Do you have proof that Judge Dugan herself authorized these changes?" Bondi clicked a remote, and the overhead screen flickered to life, displaying 2 versions of a ruling. "This is the public version of a judgment filed by Judge Dugan," she said, pointing to the left. "This is the internal version recovered from metadata logs created 5 hours later. The revised language removed a penalty clause benefiting a nonprofit linked to her family. We traced keystroke logs to her assistant's credentials, acting under her direct instruction to clean up the language." The room went still, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Kennedy's eyes narrowed, his voice low but piercing. "Ms. Bondi, you're telling us the judge didn't just make a bad call. She rewrote justice to protect her own. Is that right?" Bondi nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Senator. And it wasn't just her. The pattern repeats across multiple cases." Kennedy leaned forward, his folksy tone giving way to something harder. "Let's talk plain then. If this is a pattern, who else knew about it? Because I'm finding it hard to believe one judge pulled this off without anybody in this town batting an eye." The question landed like a grenade, and Van Hollen's face paled. Bondi paused, not for effect, but to ensure her words carried maximum weight. Preliminary concerns were raised at the Grant Oversight Division last year, Senator Kennedy. An email flagged irregular timing between a ruling and a grant, but the thread was archived without escalation. No one followed up. Kennedy's pen stopped moving. Archived, he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Sounds like somebody wanted this swept under the rug. Who's in charge of that Oversight Division?" Bondi's response was calm but devastating. "The division reports to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Grants and Oversight, which includes members of this committee." A collective gasp swept the room, and Van Hollen's hands clenched into fists. Kennedy didn't smile, but his eyes gleamed with the realization that the trap Van Hollen had set was collapsing. "Well, now," he said, his drawl returning, but laced with steel. "That's mighty interesting. So we got a judge rewriting rulings, a non-profit, with her family's fingerprints all over it, and an oversight division that's playing hide-and-seek with the truth. Ms. Bondi, you got any more of these documents?" Bondi slid another sheet across the table. "This is a financial flowchart showing $11.2 million in federal grants to two nonprofits, both linked to Dugan's rulings. One of them, Harbor Equity Alliance, lists a board member who was her former law partner. That relationship was also undisclosed." Kennedy whistled softly, a gesture that belied the gravity of the moment. "Sounds like we're not just talking about a bad apple, Ms. Bondi. Sounds like the whole orchard's got worms." The chamber buzzed, the press gallery a frenzy of activity as reporters typed out headlines in real time. Van Hollen tried to interject, his voice sharp. "Senator Kennedy, this is veering into speculation. We're here to discuss Ms. Bondi's conduct, not to chase shadows." But Kennedy wasn't having it. "With all due respect, Senator, I'm not chasing shadows. I'm following a paper trail, and it's leading somewhere you don't seem too keen to go." The rebuke was polite but brutal, and the room felt it. Mason tapped her gavel lightly, restoring order. "Senator Kennedy, do you have a specific question for the witness?" Kennedy nodded his gaze, never leaving Bondi. "I do, Madam Chair." "Ms. Bondi, you said these rulings benefited specific groups. Can you tell us if any of those groups had ties to folks in this room?" The question was a dagger, and Van Hollen's face froze. Bondi didn't blink. "We're still reviewing connections, Senator, but I can confirm that one nonprofit, Stonebridge Strategic Consulting, had representatives meet with congressional offices, including members of this committee, before key rulings were issued." The chamber erupted again, louder this time, as aides scrambled to relay the implication. Kennedy leaned back, his expression calm, but his mind clearly turning. "Stonebridge," he said slowly, as if tasting the word. "Funny how that name keeps popping up. Miss Bondi, you got any records of those meetings?" Bondi nodded, producing a calendar printout. "This is an access log from the Capitol Visitors System showing visits by Stonebridge representatives to several offices over the past 20 months. Kennedy took the document, scanning it briefly, before passing it to Mason. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice low but resonant. "Looks like we've got some homework to do." Van Hollen's voice cut through, strained now. "This is a distraction, Senator Kennedy. These meetings are routine. Lobbyists meet with staffers every day." Kennedy turned to him, his drawl slow and deliberate. "Routine don't mean right, Senator. Not when those meetings line up with rulings that smell like they were bought and paid for. The words hit hard, and Van Hollen fell silent, his earlier swagger gone. Kennedy turned back to Bondi. "Ms. Bondi, one last thing. You said this pattern repeats. How many other judges are we talking about?" Bondi's answer was quiet but seismic. At least 5 senators across 4 states, all under review for similar patterns. The room went deathly still, the weight of her words sinking in. Kennedy nodded slowly, his face unreadable, but his resolve clear. 5, he repeated. "Well, Madam Chair, I reckon we've got more than a hearing on our hands. We've got a reckoning." The gavel fell, signaling a brief recess, but the tension didn't dissipate. Reporters surged toward the exits, phones buzzing with breaking news alerts. Aides huddled in corners, whispering about the implications. Van Hollen sat motionless, his opening statement crumpled in his hand, his trap now a smoldering ruin. Kennedy gathered his notes, his calm exterior masking the fire in his chest. He'd come to the hearing expecting a political skirmish, but what he'd found was a war, one he wasn't about to back down from. Bondi's evidence had cracked open a door, and Kennedy was already planning his next move. The chamber emptied, but the echoes of the morning's revelations lingered, a warning that this was only the beginning. Outside, the Capitol's marble facade gleamed in the sunlight. But inside, the foundations of power were trembling, and John Kennedy was just getting started. The hearing chamber had settled into a brittle stillness. As the recess ended, the kind of quiet that follows a storm when everyone knows another is brewing. The marble walls, polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflected the flickering lights of cameras and the tense faces of senators returning to their seats. Reporters now packed tighter in the press gallery, typed furiously, their screens glowing with half-formed headlines about the bombshells dropped in the morning session. Upper Senator John Kennedy, his glasses perched low on his nose, sat at the committee table, his fingers tracing the edge of a new folder labeled Exhibit B Financial Networks. His folksy demeanor was still there, but it was sharper now, honed by the morning's revelations and the realization that the web of corruption Pam Bondi had begun to unravel was far wider than anyone had anticipated. Across the room, Upper Senator Mark Van Hollen adjusted his tie, his earlier confidence replaced by a guarded intensity. He'd called this hearing to discredit Bondi, to paint her investigation into Judge Linda Dugan's arrest as overreach. But Kennedy's pointed questions had shifted the narrative. Now the room buzzed with a new question: how deep did this go? Chairwoman Judy Mason banged the gavel, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "The committee will resume. Ms. Bondi, please continue." Kennedy leaned forward, his eyes locked on Bondi, ready to steer the hearing into uncharted waters. Bondi stood her black blazer as crisp as ever and clicked the remote to bring the overhead screen to life. A flowchart appeared, not the simple one from the morning session, but a complex web of red and blue lines connecting entities' dates and dollar amounts. This, she began, her voice calm but unyielding, is a map of financial disbursements from 2 nonprofits, Stonebridge Strategic Consulting and Harbor Equity Alliance, to various consulting firms and legal advisory groups over the past 3 years. These groups received a combined $11.2 million in federal grants, and their activities directly influenced at least 6 judicial rulings, including those issued by Judge Dugan. The screen zoomed in on Stonebridge, its name bolded at the center of the web. Kennedy tilted his head, his drawl cutting through the murmurs. "Ms. Bondi, you're saying these folks got millions in taxpayer money, and it just so happens they're tied to rulings that let 'em keep it. That sound about right?" Bondi nodded. "Exactly, Senator. And the money didn't just flow to them, it flowed through them to subcontractors and consultants with ties to judicial and congressional offices. Kennedy's pen tapped the table a slow, deliberate rhythm. Let's talk about those ties. You mentioned Stonebridge meeting with folks in this building. Who were they talking to, and what were they whispering about? Bondi clicked again, and a new slide appeared. A scanned email with a subject line reading, Litigation Strategy, Greenbrook Case. The sender was a Stonebridge senior associate, and the recipient was a congressional staffer named Tyler Morris, formerly of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Grants and Oversight. This email, Bondi said, was sent 6 days before Judge Dugan's ruling in the Greenbrook case, which granted a $3.4 million federal contract to a Stonebridge-affiliated nonprofit. The email outlines suggested language for the ruling which appeared nearly verbatim in the final court document. The chamber stirred aides whispering reporters, typing faster. Kennedy's voice was low but piercing. Now hold on. You're telling me a lobbyist wrote the judge's homework and it got turned in as law. That's a mighty cozy arrangement. Van Hollen interjected, his voice tight with irritation. Senator Kennedy, this is speculative. Emails get sent every day. You can't prove this influenced a federal ruling. Kennedy turned to him, his drawl laced with steel. Can't prove it, Senator. We've got an email with the judge's exact words sent before the ink was dry. That ain't coincidence. It's choreography. The room erupted in murmurs, and Mason tapped her gavel lightly. Order, please. Ms. Bondi, can you confirm the authenticity of this email? Bondi nodded. It was obtained through a subpoena and verified by our forensic team. The metadata matches, and the recipient, Tyler Morris, left his Senate position 8 months ago to join Harbor Equity as general counsel. Kennedy whistled softly. Well, I'll be. Sounds like Mr. Morris found himself a nice promotion. Any chance he was drafting laws here while planning his next job there? Bondi's response was measured. We have records of Morris participating in drafting sessions for federal oversight protocols, including amendments that relaxed reporting requirements for grant recipients. Those amendments passed 6 weeks before Stonebridge's involvement in 2 key cases. The screen shifted again now, displaying a timeline of financial transactions. Bondi pointed to a highlighted entry. Here, Stonebridge received a $1.8 million consulting fee from Harbor Equity, deducted directly from a federal grant. The payment was authorized 3 days after a ruling that shielded Harbor Equity from an audit. Kennedy leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. So, let me get this straight. These folks get federal money, use it to hire themselves as consultants, and then get a judge to make sure nobody asks questions. That's not a business, it's a racket. The press gallery buzzed, and even some senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Van Hollen tried to pivot. Ms. Bondi, you're implying a vast conspiracy without direct evidence of criminal intent. Consulting fees are legal. Meetings are legal. You're building a narrative, not a case. Kennedy didn't let Bondi respond. Legal don't mean ethical, Senator, he said, his voice calm but firm. And when the same names keep showing up in the same places with the same money, I start wondering who's really running the show. Bondi clicked to the next slide, a grainy audio waveform labeled Recording, February 18th, 2023. She spoke evenly. This is a conversation between Jeremy Alton, a former clerk for Judge Dugan, and Claire Meyer, her assistant. It was obtained anonymously, but authenticated by 2 forensic specialists. She pressed play, and the speakers crackled to life. A male voice, irritated, said, She wants this off the docket before the quarter closes. Just fix the footnote and take out the subsidy clause. A female voice, hesitant, replied, But if we remove that, it contradicts prior cases. The man snapped, "Doesn't matter. She's got the outcome. Make it look like precedent." The recording stopped, and the room went silent, the weight of the words sinking in like lead. Kennedy's pen froze mid-air. "Ms. Bondi," he said slowly, "you're telling us the judge told her staff to rewrite a ruling to hide something that could have triggered an audit." Bondi nodded. "Yes, Senator. That clause would have required a review by the Federal Audit Bureau. Without it, the case closed without scrutiny affecting thousands of plaintiffs." Kennedy leaned back, his drawl returning but heavier now. "Well, ain't that something? Sounds like justice got a makeover, and nobody noticed till you came along." He turned to Mason. "Madam Chair, I move. We request a full transcript of this recording and any related communications. If this is what it looks like, we're not just talking about one judge, we're talking about a system that's letting this happen." Mason nodded, her expression grim. "Agreed. The clerk will secure the transcript." Van Hollen's face was red now, his voice strained. "This is one conversation, Senator Kennedy. You're blowing it out of proportion." Kennedy's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "One conversation, sure. But when it's got the judge's fingerprints on it and it lines up with millions in grants, I'd say it's proportionate enough to keep digging." The room felt smaller now, the air thicker with the realization that Kennedy wasn't just asking questions, he was pulling threads that could unravel an entire network. Bondi advanced the slide, revealing a list of 5 federal judges, each tied to cases with similar patterns of undisclosed ties and favorable rulings. "These judges," she said, "are currently under review by the Office of the Inspector General for connections to Stonebridge and its affiliates." Kennedy's voice cut through again. 5 judges, Ms. Bondi. That's a mighty big club. Any of 'em still presiding over cases?" Bondi's answer was calm but devastating. 3 of them, Senator. Their recusal status is under review." The chamber erupted in whispers, and Kennedy let out a low whistle. 3 judges still on the bench handing out rulings, while we're sitting here talking about their ties to this mess. Madam Chair, I reckon we need to speed up that review." Mason's voice was firm. "We will, Senator. This committee will request an immediate status update from the Inspector General." Kennedy nodded, his gaze shifting to Van Hollen, who sat silent, his earlier bravado replaced by a tense calculation. The hearing was no longer about Bondi's conduct. It was about a system that Kennedy was forcing into the light, one document, one question at a time. As the session paused for another brief recess, the press gallery exploded into activity, reporters racing to file stories about Kennedy's relentless push. Aides whispered about the implications, some glancing nervously at Van Hollen, whose trap had not only failed, but had turned him into a bystander in his own theater. Kennedy gathered his notes, his calm exterior masking the fire in his chest. He'd come to the hearing to listen, but now he was leading, and the web Bondi had exposed was only the beginning. Outside, the Capitol's halls echoed with the footsteps of staffers rushing to relay the news. But inside, Kennedy knew the real work was just starting. The threads he'd pulled today would lead somewhere darker, and he was ready to follow them no matter where they went. The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber felt different now, its grandeur muted by the weight of what had unfolded over the past hours. The marble pillars stood silent witnesses to a reckoning that had transformed a routine hearing into a seismic event. The press gallery, once a hive of frenetic typing, now held reporters who sat in rapt attention, their notepads nearly forgotten as they absorbed the gravity of the moment. The cameras still rolled, but their hum was softer, as if even the machinery understood that this was no longer about sound bites, but about history. Thupper Senator John Kennedy, his glasses reflecting the dim chamber lights, stood at the center of it all. not with the theatrical flair some expected, but with a quiet resolve that commanded the room. His folder, now worn at the edges from hours of use, lay open before him, its contents a roadmap of truths he'd forced into the open. Across the table, Thupper Senator Mark Van Hollen sat, slumped his once crisp tie, loosened his face, a mask of strained composure. The trap he'd set to discredit Pam Bondi had collapsed, and Kennedy's relentless pursuit of the facts had exposed a network of corruption that reached far beyond Judge Linda Dugan. Chairwoman Judy Mason, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination, called the final session to order. "We resume," she said, her voice steady but heavy. "Senator Kennedy, you have the floor." Kennedy nodded, his southern drawl carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Thank y'all for staying. We've got one more piece of business to settle." Kennedy reached for a sealed, leather-bound dossier, its Department of Records stamp gleaming under the lights. "This," he said, holding it aloft, "ain't just a pile of papers. It's every document, every email, every wire transfer, every whisper we've talked about today, bound together and certified under oath. It's the truth, plain and simple, and it's going where it can't be ignored." He placed the dossier on the table with a deliberate thud, his eyes scanning the room. "This morning, copies of this record were sent to the Office of the Inspector General, the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, and the Judicial Oversight Committee. They've got no choice now but to act." The chamber stirred, aides exchanging glances, reporters scribbling again. Van Hollen's voice, hoarse, now cut through. "Senator Kennedy, you're turning this into a witch hunt. You're dragging good people through the mud without proof of criminality." Kennedy turned to him, his drawl slow and unyielding. "Senator, if the truth feels like a hunt, maybe it's 'cause some folks been hiding. I ain't dragging anybody, I'm just holding up a mirror." Kennedy opened the dossier, pulling out a single sheet, a sworn affidavit from a whistleblower named Aaron Matthews, a former court analyst. "This is Aaron's story," he said, his voice softening but never wavering. "He flagged a financial irregularity in a case Judge Dugan oversaw. Thought he was doing his job. Instead, he got moved to facilities support, locked out of the system, no explanation. He filed a complaint, and it was closed in 2 days flat. No interview, no nothing." Kennedy paused, letting the words land. "Aaron ain't here today 'cause he's scared for his family. But he gave us this affidavit, and it says what we've all seen: the system don't just fail folks who speak up, it punishes them." The room went still, the weight of Aaron's story sinking in. Kennedy's eyes met Mason's. "Madam Chair, I move we unseal every whistleblower complaint tied to these cases. Let's hear from the folks who paid the price for telling the truth." Mason nodded, her voice firm. "Motion accepted. The clerk will prepare the requests." Van Hollen tried one last stand, his voice rising. "This is reckless, Senator Kennedy. You're tearing down institutions that have stood for decades." Kennedy's response was calm but devastating. "If those institutions can't stand the light, Senator, maybe they ain't as sturdy as you think." He turned to Bondi, who'd remained silent but attentive. "Ms. Bondi, you've given us a lot today. One last question: how do we stop this from happening again?" Bondi stood, her voice clear. "You start by making silence more dangerous than speaking up. Transparency, accountability, and consequences. Those are the only tools that work." Kennedy nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. "You hear that, folks? Transparency ain't a buzzword. It's a lifeline. And if we don't grab it now, We're leaving the next Aaron Matthews to fend for himself. The screen behind Kennedy flickered, displaying a simple chart, a list of proposed reforms, including mandatory financial disclosures for judges, public access to complaint logs, and independent audits of grant recipients. "This ain't my idea," Kennedy said, pointing to the screen. "It's what folks like Aaron and the others who spoke up have been begging for. We owe 'em more than a pat on the back. We owe 'em a system that don't chew 'em up and spit 'em out." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I got a letter from a law student yesterday asking me why she should keep studying when the system seems rigged. I didn't have a good answer then, but I do now. We fix it, not for us, but for her. For the folks who still believe justice ain't just a word in a textbook." The chamber was silent, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Kennedy's words weren't just a closing statement. They were a call to action. Mason spoke, her voice quieter now. "Senator Kennedy, this committee will review your proposed reforms in an emergency session. We won't let this moment pass." Kennedy nodded, gathering his notes. "Thank y'all. Let's make sure the next time a truth-teller steps up, they don't have to climb a mountain to be heard." As the gavel fell, the room erupted not in chaos but in movement. Reporters rushed to file stories, aides huddled to draft responses, and senators whispered about the fallout. Outside, the news was already spreading, judges stepping down, nonprofits closing, and a top aide to Van Hollen resigning without explanation. But the real impact was quieter, deeper. The lesson wasn't in the headlines, it was in the faces of those watching, from law students to court clerks who saw in Kennedy's stand a reminder that courage isn't loud or flashy. It's the steady, unrelenting choice to demand truth, even when the cost is high. It's the belief that one voice armed with facts and conviction can spark a movement. Kennedy didn't just expose a network. He showed that integrity is built not in grand gestures, but in the quiet refusal to look away. As the chamber emptied, the echoes of his words lingered, a challenge to everyone. When silence is the system's shield, speaking up is the only way to break it. And for the next generation learning law in classrooms or fighting for justice in courtrooms, Kennedy's stand offered a blueprint. Change starts with those who dare to lose fear first.